Hello, everybody. Welcome to the closing plenary of this long-awaited 2021 joint conference of the International Degrowth Research Networks, the International Society for Ecological Economics, and the European Society for Ecological Economics, which is hosted by our tireless and brilliant friends at the University of Manchester. We're all very excited to welcome George Monbiot tonight to talk to us on the topic of private sufficiency, public luxury. George doesn't really need an introduction, but for those of you who've been living under a rock for the last few decades, George is a Guardian columnist. He is a prolific author. Lots of you will have read his books. There are too many to list. You might have heard of Out of the Wreckage, Feral before that, his book on rewilding, Heat, which for me, that propelled me into climate activism. I imagine it did the same for many of you. And I know George has just finished writing his recent book on how to feed the world without devouring the planet. So that's exciting too. Did I mention that George is an activist? I'm not sure if I should mention that as well. He's someone who walks the talk. He's not adverse to chaining himself to diggers in open cast coal mines when needs must. And I wanted to say as well that in spite of being one of the most sought after brains in the environmental justice movement, anyone who's worked with George will know that he remains one of the most down to earth and humble and generous spirited people you can encounter. So before I get too carried away, I will give the mic, give the floor, the pixels over to George Monbiot. Thanks, George.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Beth. Thank you for your very kind words. And it's great to be here. And sort of it's a bit like the Euros, isn't it? We finally made it. What Beth left out actually is that we worked together with 5 other amazing people on the Land for the Many report, which was commissioned by the Labour Party and triggered a massive storm in the billionaire press when it was published just before the last election. And it was a total delight working with Beth and the other authors. And I was the sort of the one who didn't really know my proverbial from my elbow, but I was sort of the editor of the report, but they were all the brains, and it was really enlightening and a wonderful experience. So thank you, Beth, and thank you so much for hosting this. Now, there's a phrase, an old saying, which is often erroneously attributed to Honoré de Balzac, which is that behind every great fortune lies a great crime. And I think it's fair to say that in most cases that's true. We could all think of a few examples. It's not universally true, though. There are musicians and novelists and even footballers and others who have made an awful lot of money by giving people pleasure. And it would be hard to describe their activities as a crime. Well, it depends on the goals, but on the whole, this is not criminally acquired money. It doesn't cause any great harm. But I think it is true, and I think it is a universal rule, to say that in front of every great fortune lies a great crime. Because there's now a large body of research showing that it doesn't really matter very much what your attitudes are, how you think of yourself, whether you think of yourself as a green consumer or a not green consumer, an ordinary consumer, or not a consumer at all, a citizen or a subject. The impacts that you exert on the living planet are more or less a function of the amount of money you have. That the attitudes scarcely feature at all. The only place where they seem to make a difference is in diet. But in the rest of it, in terms of housing footprint, in terms of transport footprint, and so many other heating, electricity use, the rest of it, it's pretty well matched to your income. And I think possibly one of the reasons why it makes so little difference is that we are phenomenally good at deceiving ourselves. We say, well, I do my recycling, so obviously I'm green. Oh yeah, the flight to Thailand, yeah, and to the holiday home in the Bahamas and the Dordogne and Tuscany. Yeah, well, but yeah, I do my recycling. And basically when people have a lot of money, unless they give it all away, and that is an option. It's got its own, there's issues surrounding that, but broadly speaking, they will spend it, and the spending will almost always translate into high environmental impacts. And so you get these extraordinary phenomena where very rich people come together to say, what should we do about the environmental crisis? And from time to time, you get these meetings, these gatherings of billionaires or of rock stars and actors and other people with enormous incomes. And they come together on a Mediterranean island or a Caribbean island. They'll turn up in their super yachts or on their private planes. And they'll drive around the island in supercars. And then they'll sit down, and this is, I come across this quite often because they sort of cross my journalistic horizon, these meetings. And they'll sit down and they'll earnestly and sincerely discuss what we should do about the environmental crisis. And generally the answer they come up with is those people breeding. Basically, population is the issue. There's too many babies in the world, because fundamentally that's the only thing for which they can't be blamed. On the whole, billionaires don't have a huge number of children. By and large, higher birth rates are associated with high levels of poverty and, of course, low opportunities for women. Those who tend to have the most children have the lowest environmental impacts. Those with the highest environmental impacts tend to have fewer children, broadly speaking. And so that's the one issue for which they can't be blamed, and they can exonerate themselves. So obviously that's the issue which they harp on about and on about and on about. They never quite explain what's going to be done about it, but they really love to hear that the problem is population growth. So for instance, at the World Economic Forum, Jane Goodall, the famous primatologist, said all our problems would be solved if we return to the global population on Earth 500 years ago. Now, there were about 500 million people on Earth 500 years ago. It's sort of an easy fantasy to have, a sort of Hesiod's golden age, if you like, when we were all sort of hale and huge and leisured and just hung around living the life of the gods. But actually, obviously, it wasn't like that at all. But also, the people she was speaking to at the World Economic Forum, if there were 500 million of them on Earth, they would cook the planet just as surely as 50 billion people living in the way that the poorest half of the world's population does. And it rankled with me particularly because a few months before, Jane Goodall had appeared in an advertisement for British Airways. And British Airways tends to take fairly rich customers, far higher than the average wage. Rich people disproportionately take flights. Only 20% of the world's people have ever stepped on, 20% have ever stepped on a plane. And the frequent flyers generally are those with their second homes in Tuscany or the Caribbean or wherever. And it just, for me, rankled really badly that here we have someone promoting very high environmental impacts, generally by the rich, then telling the rich that the problem was basically other people's numbers. So we're good at deceiving ourselves. And because we're good at deceiving ourselves, our attitudes really make very little difference to our environmental impact, because spending pretty well matches impact. So that leads to really an obvious environmental conclusion, and it's a conclusion spelt out by the Belgian philosopher Ingrid Robbins, that if we are going to live lives within planetary boundaries, lives which respect the lives of others, either those who exist today or those yet to be born, lives which respect the rest of life on Earth, the non-human or more than human life on Earth, then not only should there be a poverty line below which no one is allowed to fall, there should be a wealth line above which no one is allowed to rise. There should be a maximum amount of wealth that anyone should be able to command themselves. Now, of course, this is among the most blasphemous ideas of the 21st century. and you raise it in polite society, and I very much hope this is not polite society, and you attract all sorts of brickbats and obloquy as a result. But it's very hard philosophically to wriggle your way out of that position, because otherwise you're saying these people's lives are effectively worth more than other people's. They're allowed to grab the resources, the environmental space, which other people are going to need, which other species need, which other habitats need, which we all need to live within without breaching environmental boundaries. And space grabbing and resource grabbing is fundamentally what wealth does, or what capital does. If you've got your private jet, you will grab more atmospheric space than the great majority of citizens. If you've got your super home, you'll grab more geographical space. If you've got 5 super homes, even more. And the story we're told, which sits at the heart of capitalism, is that it is the rising tide that lifts all boats. We haven't been told, that term hasn't been used for quite a while because it's become blinking obvious that it's not lifting all boats, and great majority of boats are stuck in the mud and the tide is rising over them. But the story was always that everyone will become prosperous as a result of capitalism. Now, of course, that can't possibly be true for a couple of fundamental reasons. And one of those reasons is that the wealth which fuels the capitalist machine is extracted from elsewhere, either in time or in space. So, for instance, one estimate suggests that the British extracted at today's value $45 trillion from India, effectively stolen by taxing people to pay for the colonial project, taxing them above the cost of the colonial project. So basically, you're taxed for having your land and your livelihood stolen. And then that 45 trillion was reinvested into other colonial projects around the world, which were basically just looting, effectively. You steal the land, you steal the wealth, you steal the people, in terms of the slave trade, or for that matter, indentured labor. It is effectively the theft of people's lives. And a huge part of what we call capitalist enterprise is actually looting. And it's very hard to separate that out from the non-looting aspects of capitalist enterprise, because of course it's the money meshes it all together. There's a very telling moment in Jane Eyre where it's been established already that Rochester's money is contaminated. And it's contaminated by the means by which he acquired it, by the slave trade, effectively, by the plantations in the West Indies. It's racially contaminated, and there's a sense that his marriage is racially contaminating. But by contrast, when Jane comes into her money, Charlotte Bronte makes it very clear that these are English investments. And she wants to say, this is not contaminated money, this is clean money. So this is all right. It doesn't bear that blood burden that Rochester's money bears. It's English investments. But there's no English investment which could be cleanly separated from the contaminated money coming from the Caribbean, coming from India, coming from the other colonies, coming from the straightforward theft, the grabbing, the going at it blind, as Conrad put it, of stealing other people's resources and other people's lives. It was completely enmeshed and entwined. And the same thing happens today by environmental means. Well, not just environmental means, it also happens through transfer pricing, through international debt used as leverage for extracting resources, structural adjustment and its modern equivalents, of course, trade deals, particularly bilateral trade deals with their outrageous terms, including the international arbitration, which effectively forces countries to give up their resources for almost nothing. There's 1,000 ways today by which capitalism remains looting in space from one place to another, extracting resources from the extraction, the sacrifice zones, and bringing them into the centres of capital. And we know that the City of London, as several international magistrates have pointed out, is the world capital for money laundering. That's where the contaminated money goes through and is then pushed out through the tax havens, with the City of London sitting at the centre of an international web of tax havens, many of which are former British colonies, dependencies, crown territories, and it's the whole thing just disappears. The money disappears. So whether it's money which has been extracted in the form of blood minerals from West Africa, drugs money from cartels in Colombia or Mexico, money laundering in the Balkans, wherever it might be, laundering of weapons money, whatever, it gets funneled through the City of London and it gets disappeared. So it's still a looting machine. It's still a means by which wealth is extracted effectively by robbery from other nations. But then there's also the environmental looting, which is very similar, takes place. Now, Joseph Stiglitz's latest book, and this is a man I greatly admire in many ways, but he does have a sort of tendency not to see the bigger picture. He sets out to establish that there are two kinds of wealth, or two kinds of gaining wealth. There's wealth creation and wealth extraction. And we all recognise, and Beth has written brilliantly on this herself, the difference between enterprise capitalism and rentier capitalism, and what rentier capitalism is doing in its incredibly destructive ways with this sort of gatekeeping, forcing people to pay for access to essential resources. And we all recognise that. But actually, from the environmental perspective, there really is no clear distinction between wealth creation and wealth extraction. Because if you make yourself rich, you're going to spend that money and it's going to turn into wealth extraction in environmental terms. And we all probably know people who are environmental academics or consultants, people who have made their money in apparently green ways, who then take their holiday to Thailand or buy their SUV or whatever it might be, because, well, they're worth it. This is what we're like. I'm not blaming anyone, any individual, but this just is the human tendency. We reward ourselves and we tell ourselves that we've earned it. We have the right to indulge ourselves a bit. That everybody else, obviously, they don't have quite my virtue, so they shouldn't be able to do it. But I've earned this, so just a little bit of an indulgence, just a little SUV. And so that distinction breaks down, just as the distinction between Jane's money and Rochester's money breaks down, because the two things are intrinsically connected. And even more so, of course, as a result of all the confusions surrounding efficiency and rebound and the rest of it. You're all aware of the Jevons effect, or the Khazun-Brooks paradox, as the updated version is, that efficiency actually tends to lead to greater resource use. And so many of the measures we think are green, that we think are leading to greater, to lower resource use, can actually have exactly the opposite effect. So it's very, very difficult to disentangle, especially when you're looking at what I call temporal looting through time, the idea of wealth creation from the idea of wealth extraction. And the second way in which this idea that we can all become fantastically rich, as if capitalism is a competition between equals rather than some people grabbing the wealth belonging to others and fueling the capitalist means in that way, is that if we all became rich, if we all did turn out to be temporarily embarrassed millionaires, we would instantly overwhelm the planet's capacity. It just wouldn't be possible to support even a fraction of the current world population if we all became millionaires. It's simply, there isn't even enough physical space. You know, if we all wanted that great big home, and we all wanted the great big garden around that home, and the private island, and the landing strip for our private jet, and the mooring for our private yacht, I mean, we would need dozens of planets to provide that space. It simply does not exist. So even in physical terms, you can't accommodate wealth as it is currently and will doubtless always be expressed, private wealth, let alone in ecological terms. There's not enough atmospheric space. There's not enough bluefin tuna. There's not enough mahogany. There's not enough nickel. There's not enough chromium. There's not enough gold, platinum, titanium to support the way the rich now live. And the only way that they can continue to pursue private luxury of that kind is by the rest of us not doing so. It's only because they're few in number that what we recognize as private luxury, which is a promise which has been made to everyone, you can all have this thing, private luxury can only be sustained because we can't all have it, or we don't yet all have it. If we did, that would be curtains for everyone. It would be the closing of the benign conditions which allowed human life and the rest of the life of the Holocene, or indeed the Anthropocene, to prosper. But there's something even deeper but beneath this, a bigger question, which I'm just staggered is asked so little, particularly in sort of wider public life in the media, which is, how is it that these numbers in your bank account, this capital that you possess, or indeed this income that you earn, how does that translate into a right to own natural wealth? By what law, by what norm, by what philosophical principle that do the numbers in your account, whether it's your secret account in Panama City, or whether it's your co-op bank account here in the UK, entitle you to buy land or minerals or atmospheric space? What gives you the right to acquire natural wealth with your capital, with your money? And I mean, people are stumped by the question, not just because they can't answer it, but because it takes a long time to process that it's a question that needs to be asked and answered. And yet it seems to me one of the most fundamental questions of economics, which should be on everyone's lips all the time. What is it that gives me, with these numbers I've got, more right to natural wealth than someone who doesn't have these numbers in their account? Why do the numbers translate into greater rights? Because that's what we're talking about. I mean, this whole notion that we're equal before the law, I mean, what bollocks that is. It's just extraordinary. You know, people will say we're equal before the law, and the next breath they'll say property is 90% of the law. Well, unless you're equal property owners, how could you possibly be equal before the law when so much of the law is bound up with property and rights to property and excluding other people from your property and preventing other people from having your property? How can we possibly have even the very notion of equality before the law under those circumstances? And yet the entire body of law and the entire body of economics is based on the fact that inequality is somehow natural and legal and philosophically justified. Now, inequality to the use of the planet's wealth, our fundamental and crucial resources. And if anyone does try to answer this, generally they turn to John Locke and his second treatise of government. And what Locke did was to claim that you acquire your right to natural wealth, in this case land, by mixing your labor with it. You mix your labor with the land, and that then entitles you to claim ownership of that land. So you have this picture in your head of someone turning up with a spade and digging a hole and then saying, because I've dug this hole, this land now belongs to me. And this really is the basis of English and US property law, effectively, and indeed in many other parts of the world, because it was picked up by people like William Blackstone, the great legal writer, whose writings became so influential in the US in determining the scope of much of their law, particularly property law, And it bounced all around the world, this idea that your legal right to natural wealth comes from mixing your labor with it. So how does this work? Well, Locke said, in the beginning, all the world was America. And what he's trying to say there is all the world was terra nullius. It was a land without people, a land without rights, and the right to ownership came along with the first person who mixed their labor with it. Now, Locke held an important colonial position in the British colonies in Eastern North America. And his role was, to some extent, to justify the acquisition of territory there, which of course was not terra nullius, as we well know. It was occupied. It belonged to, not in any formal sense, but in a sense of sort of deep belonging. People belonged to the land belonged to people. The indigenous people of the Americas had been there for 14,000 years before Locke and his people turned up. But in a way, he was right in that all the world was once America, in that all the world was once colonized by people like him, not necessarily Europeans, but much of it obviously by Europeans, who then disregarded the land rights of the people who were there already and pretended that those people were either not people or not people with any right which needed to be legally or morally recognized. And so what his doctrine of mixing the labor with the land requires is a year zero. There's a point where everything in the past has been cleared. The whole past has been erased. There's a tabula rasa, and you turn up and say, right, there is no one here or no one I need to take any account of. And by the way, we probably just killed those people, so there really is no one here now. So I am going to be the person who digs this hole, mixes my labor with the land, and the land is therefore mine. But strangely, another person then can't come along with another spade and dig a hole in that same piece of land and say, well, I've now mixed my labor with the land, so the land is mine. That person would probably have a sword put through him, because it turns out, but again, Locke doesn't explore this, is that not only do you create a year zero going backwards, you create a year zero going forwards as well. Is when that first person who claims to be the first person puts that spade in the ground for the first time, they then acquire rights in perpetuity. And not just them, but their children and their children's children and children's children, or whoever they happen to sell that land to. But no one else can come along and mix their labor with the land and acquire land rights in that way. But then it becomes even weirder and even more pernicious, because Locke then says, oh, by the way, when I'm saying you mix your labor with the land, obviously your labor includes the labor that belongs to you. In other words, other people whom you employ or own, mixing their labor with the land. And you say, well, hang on a minute, how does that work? You're not actually mixing your labor with the land. If your servants or slaves are digging the hole, it's them who's mixing the labor with the land. Why don't they acquire the land rights? And what you discover, and this is more than a little convenient for Locke's position at the time, is that what he's effectively doing is establishing, in terms of large-scale land ownership, the human rights of slave owners. That's how you mix your labor with the land over a wide area of land, by owning slaves. So effectively, it was a charter for slave owners, his second treatise of government. And somehow we've completely overlooked this. We just sort of we just accept it as if it were a natural law, this completely preposterous series of unexamined assumptions and logical leaps. I mean, it's as stupid as your average editorial in The Spectator. I mean, that's how completely insane it is. But somehow we just accept that as a natural law. And even if you could overcome all those other objections, what's so magic about labor? Why does digging a hole in the ground entitle you to that land? What is it that gives it that magical property that you like transform it from base metal into gold by sticking a spade in the land? I mean, why not establish your land rights by pissing on it? That's what other species do. It would seem to be a more natural law that you get your territory by pissing on the land than it does by digging a hole on the land or doing any other form of labor mixing with that land. So we have this utterly absurd proposition. And what you discover is that absurd proposition sits right at the heart of law and of economics. That's the extraordinary position in which we find ourselves. So we have a situation where capitalism simply can't deliver what it claims to deliver. It can't move us all towards private luxury. We are not all temporarily embarrassed millionaires. We can't reasonably persuade ourselves that we're all on the same trajectory. Some people are on that trajectory, some people are on that, and some people are on that. And the people on that one are exploiting the people on that one. That's how it works. And the reason people are on that one is that they're being exploited by the people on that one. And the reason people are on that one is that they're doing the exploiting. That is how the system works. So it's based on a lie, a fundamental lie. And then that lie in turn is based on an even more fundamental lie, which is what justifies that disproportionate ownership and control of natural wealth. And of course, mixed in with this is this idea that there is simply not enough for everyone to live like that, or not at any rate if we use it to acquire private luxury. Because what private luxury does in a resource-constrained world, and by resources I include actual physical space, is it shuts other people out. It excludes other people from having a share in that natural wealth. But by definition, that is exactly what property is. That's what property is for, is to exclude other people and to claim that natural wealth exclusively for yourself. That's why you get an exclusive development of 5-bedroom homes advertised rather than an inclusive development. That's what it means. Property is exclusion. And so the idea that, you know, we could all gain this private luxury, obviously you can't do that because it's about excluding other people. As you accumulate private luxury, you exclude more people and their exclusion becomes greater and greater. And after a while, the fence is raised to shut us out, shut us in, because so many fences are raised and they're raised so comprehensively. So we just can't use that as a universal prescription for prosperity. Private luxury simply can't deliver for very basic physical, mathematical reasons. However, public luxury can. As what public luxury does is to create more space for everyone. So for instance, a fantastic public park is something which creates space for everybody. It takes space which might otherwise have been enclosed, grabbed by a few, and turns it into space for the many, space where anyone can turn up, as long as they are appropriately dressed or whatever other rules there might be for the park, but anyone can turn up and use that space and enjoy themselves within the limits again set by those rules. The same goes for having allotments in an allotment association, or a public swimming pool, or a tennis court, or a library, or a public transport service, or a public health service for that matter. What you do by creating really good public services and public assets is to create more for everyone. You create space which everyone can use by sharing ecological resources. You ensure that they go much further without bringing you so quickly or so far towards planetary boundaries. So we should, I believe, see public luxury as being absolutely fundamental to a world of generalized prosperity, because it is the only way in which you can achieve that. There isn't any other way to do it. You know, if everyone in Newcastle tried to get their own swimming pool and their own tennis court and their own big garden and their own art collection, Newcastle would cover the same area as London, probably. London would cover half of England. England would cover the whole of Europe. You know, there's just not enough space for us all to do it via the private route. But there is enough via the public route. Now, by public, I don't necessarily mean state, not at all. I think the state has a crucial role to play in this, but I also think that the great neglected sector of our economy, the commons, has a major role. And this is community-owned or community-controlled resources, and the Allotments Association that I belong to is a very good example of this. The land is actually owned by the council, but the Allotments Association, controlled by its members, sets the rules, distributes that land between the people in the association. It's based on equal shares. The land can't be given away, it can't be sold. It's held in perpetuity. It's got to be kept in good condition. You've got to maintain the condition or improve the condition of that land throughout your temporary tenure of it. This is a classic commons. It does everything that a commons is supposed to do. And we resolve any disputes by negotiation. We set new rules by negotiation. We review the constitution by negotiation. There's actually a really good political model. And indeed, there are many ways in which we can start to turn politics into a commons through participatory and deliberative democracy. And there's some wonderful examples being developed around the world. But we can control or own or manage a lot of our public resources at the community level, and the community can be the geographical community, it can be a community of interest, but ideally, I think, a geographical neighborhood community, as well as through local government or indeed national government. You know, and I'd like to pursue the principle of devolution, that if it can possibly be controlled by a more local unit, then it should be controlled by them, and we should only relinquish that control to a larger unit if it's not possible to manage it properly and appropriately and justly and equitably at the local level. And of course, there needs to be distribution of wealth between localities as well, which is one of the many reasons why we need effective distributive national government. So, public luxury, a fundamental principle, but also private sufficiency. I mean, I don't want there to be no private space in our lives. You know, I value my office, I value my home, but I want to live within a modest home. I don't want to live within a big home. I don't feel we should have the right to homes which are going to cause more or take more environmental resources, cause more environmental damage than is our due. Mind you, all of us in the rich nations probably inflict more damage than is our due. But you know, I think we should have our own sufficiencies. We should have things which belong to us and to no one else. That's fine. You know, I'm not calling for the total intrusion of the public sector into our lives. I'm allowing, saying, you know, we should have that compartmentalization. We should have that private space as well. But the private space should be confined to sufficiency. It should be enough for us to have a good life, but not more than enough. Now that, I think, is probably the most dangerous word in the English language in the 21st century, that word I just said twice, enough. Because that word enough offends the fundamental economic principle, which is more, which is that there must always be more. There must always be growth, must always be expansion, there must always be this thing they call economic progress, which is having more and more and more things for ourselves. Enough is perhaps the most radical word in the English language today. And enough is what Ingrid Robbins, to go back to her, is talking about when she talks about her philosophy that she calls limitarianism, of having an upper limit to how much private wealth any one person should have. And so while there should be enough in our private worlds, our private lives, to meet those needs, there should be sufficiency. It's the luxury we should be pursuing in the public sphere. And that's why this catchphrase I'm now using quite a lot is private sufficiency, public luxury. Thank you.
Well, that's wonderful. I think Beth may have frozen. Beth, are you still with us? We'll try and get Beth back as soon as we possibly can, George. But thank you so much for that talk. And for anyone watching, please do feel free to add a comment or a question in the chat box. I will do my best to bring out the most
telling me
popular
that it's just telling me my internet is unstable. So if
okay, thanks, Beth. George, while we're trying to get Beth back, maybe I could ask a question or two and abuse my position here. So we talked an awful lot there about the increased attack on population growth. That does seem to be an increasing feature of European politics in particular, and particularly amongst the far-right movements. I've actually just conducted some research on this myself. Far-right parties seem to be increasingly eschewing climate denialism and moving towards more of an eco-nativist position. And me and my co-author, we looked an awful lot at the Swiss People's Party and the old Front National, Marine Le Pen's party. And of course, it's a very racialized Malthusianism as well. It's not really a question of too much population in the abstract. It's always certain populations are growing far too much, and there's a particular focus on migrants in the discourses of certain far-right parties. It's the migrants who can't be trusted because they're certainly not invested in the local area, both emotionally and financially. They simply don't belong, so they're seen as being far more environmentally reckless anyway. And there's a growing belief as well that that allowing what they would call mass migration would lead to a big population boom. That seems to be one of the big trends at the moment in environmental politics in Europe. Did you get a sense that is cutting through in any way? Are people buying into that sort of idea? And if so, what can be done to tackle it?
Thanks very much, Dan. Well, those are all crucial questions. And the first thing I'd say is I'd love to read your paper, by the way. It sounds really interesting and very pertinent and important. Because this is, it's a huge trend. It's very big in North America as well as in Europe. And it ties in with this whole great replacement theory. They are going to come over here and replace us, and they're going to ban us and from enforce Sharia law and all this other nonsense, but which you of course are very well aware of. And this whole idea of population growth has been weaponized by the far right, but actually it's been like that, as I'm sure you know, for a very long time. I mean, one of the so-called fathers of the conservation movement in the US, Madison Grant, was a rabid eugenicist and was really fundamental in setting up the Immigration Act of the time, which was to keep out what he saw as this foreign rabble who were going to undermine our white American values. And so there has been a lot of meshing of those ideas for quite a long time. And I think as environmentalists, we need consciously to resist this. And we can absolutely acknowledge that all things being equal, more people equals higher environmental impact. I think we can acknowledge the truth of I equals P times A times T, population times affluence times technology, but at the same time recognize that a lot of the population has almost no affluence and very little technology. And so generally, where there is highest P, there is lowest A and T. And actually, so there's not much to multiply the P by, and so there's not much impact when very poor people have more children. Of course, we also know that birth rates are declining very rapidly worldwide. They've fallen in the course of, I think, 20 years from 2.1% to 1.05%. They've halved. It's a very rapid fall indeed. Unlike consumption, unlike almost anything else we're doing, population is heading towards a peak, after which it will start to decline. a very high proportion of population growth, continued growth, is the demographic bulge, which has already effectively been created. It's passing through the generations, and a lot of that is caused by longevity, because people who have already been born, were born in the 1940s, are becoming old today. And very often, you know, in the old days when you could actually talk to people in a public forum face to face, I couldn't help noticing that a very high proportion of those who raised population as an issue were post-reproductive white men. And so the question I would put to them is, well, yeah, you know, if you think this is an issue, there are two components to it. There's birth rates and there's longevity. You can't do anything about birth rates. You could do something about longevity. So if you want to form an orderly queue at the end, perhaps we could talk about what you personally could do about it. Strangely enough, they don't form that queue, because it's all about othering. It's all about pointing the finger of blame elsewhere. Whereas actually, you know, we're all equally responsible for the world's population, because we all amount to one. We're also all statistically insignificant, but people don't like to hear that. But anyway, so it's a very good way of deflecting blame, deflecting apparent concern, and passing it across. Now, I say all things being equal, population growth can lead to higher, tends to lead to higher environmental impacts. In fact, thinking about it, that's not strictly true, because recently I've been looking at the case of Tigre. And the reason I've been looking at it is, as you know, Tigre is currently effectively having a famine forced on it by the governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea, who've invaded the province, and the province of Amhara has done the same, and have cut off the supply lines, are forcing Tigrayan farmers not to farm, have destroyed grain stores, killed livestock, all the rest of it. It's a scorched earth policy with famine being used as a weapon of war. Which could lead to the extraordinary spectacle, it should lead to the extraordinary spectacle of a Nobel Prize winner, Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, appearing before the International Criminal Court. You know, he's got a Nobel Peace Prize. He is also a war criminal. It's extraordinary. He's not the first, of course, as we know. But anyway, and the story already being told by some Malthusians is, oh, here we go again, another Ethiopian famine because of all those people. But actually, Tigre is one of the world's greatest environmental success stories. And there's a series of fascinating papers, in particular one published in 2014, analysing photos taken since 1868 in northern Ethiopia, primarily in Tigre, but also northern Amhara and other parts, showing the state of the land there. And during this period, the population of Ethiopia has risen from 6.6 million to 115 million. And you would think, if you're a Malthusian, you'd think, well, that's total environmental disaster. But what we've seen in those photos is that the state of the land has steadily improved during that period. And that there's less erosion, there's less degradation, there's more trees, there's more vegetation. And in fact, amazingly, the areas of Tigre with the highest human population have the lowest degradation and the best environmental quality. How could this possibly be? Well, it's because degradation is a function not of population, it's a function of policy. And there's no intrinsic link between the number of people and environmental quality. It's a question of good governance and environmental quality. And what happened, first of all, was in the 1970s, there was land reform. Up until that point, the land had been feudally owned. There was a sort of feudal structure with a few lords owning almost everything, pushing the rest of the population up the hillsides into marginal land, where their grazing and other activities were very destructive because it was not suitable land for it, pushing people into desperation. Land reform more or less distributed the land equally amongst everyone, improving people's livelihood. But then that was followed by these massive works, deliberately commissioned, originally by the Tigrayan rebels, who later became the government, to prevent erosion, gully erosion, sheet erosion, to keep the soil on the land, to keep the water on the land, to replant trees and the rest of it. And those works required labor. because it was all done by hand. It's on steep slopes. It's very micro, you know, these tiny little soil buns and terraces and everything. You need to do it at a very fine scale if you're going to do it effectively. The little ponds, the water catchment arrangements. The more people you have, the more of those works you can do, the greater the restoration of the land. And what we've seen is that in these areas of greatest human population density, we see the lowest soil erosion, we see the greatest return of wildlife, large mammals booming in those areas, the highest number of trees, the more vegetation, the more water holding in the soil. All the environmental indicators are upwards in the areas of high population density there. And it's really an almost perfect refutation of the old idea of what causes degradation and hunger. So the answer is, yeah, curb your Malthusiasm.
It's a very good line. Thanks, George. The questions are flooding in now, and Beth is kindly sending them to me. We've sort of switched roles here. There's a number of questions about the politics of enough, but also the measurement of enough. So one question that's currently in my inbox. The politics of enough versus the politics of more. So how do we agree a definition of what is enough? Is there a certain level of wealth or a certain income that you have in your mind? What counts as enough for you, George?
Well, it's a really good question, Dan, and it's something which we need to thresh out, because I don't have the answer at the moment. Yeah, and in fact, if someone looked at me, they'd say you probably got more than enough. I probably have, actually. You know, I deliberately limit my income, but I you know, and I know I have got enough, but still books get sold and money comes in. So so, you know, I give it away, but actually maybe that money shouldn't be coming in. Exactly how we do it, exactly where we set the levels is something, you know, we urgently need to be having a big debate about. But before you can even get to that point, we need to recognize that as a goal. And, you know, Ingrid, I mean, when I stumbled across her paper about libertarianism in a very obscure journal, and she was absolutely blown away when I wrote an article in The Guardian about it. You know, I hadn't actually got in touch with her. I just, this is a fantastic idea. So I championed it. And she said, how on earth did you discover this? How did you find this? And I said, oh, just one. I follow citations trails like, you know, academics do, and one thing leads to another. And the reason she was so amazed was that she's basically been in a minority of one for so much of this time that you know, it just people don't want to hear this. It really is like blasphemy. It's like a blasphemous idea, and so we have to burst it out of that bubble of blasphemy and start having big conversations about it and thrash out exactly what it does mean, where those levels should be set, how we would move towards a world by fair means, which actually started to make libertarianism a reality. And that is a challenge for all of us. And I can't claim to have any of those answers, but, you know, let's start at least asking the questions.
I suppose one of the big dangers, George, is that, you know, it costs a lot more money to live in London than it does in, let's say, the north of England. And if we start imposing different caps on different parts of the world, suddenly we're sort of institutionalizing inequality. We're sort of saying, well, it's okay to have £30,000 a year if you live in Manchester, but if you live in a village in Kenya, it might only be 5,000. Is there a danger of cementing inequality here?
Well, that's why we're talking about wealth rather than income. And we're not talking about capital, we're talking about wealth. So we're basically talking about the natural wealth you might be able to possess. So, you know, a certain area of land or a certain amount of atmospheric space that, or other resources that you might be consuming. You know, that's where the fairness comes in, I think. You know, and yes, you're absolutely right. You know, it'll cost you more to have that certain amount of land if you're living in London than if you're living in Tigre. But you know, that's the metrics we should be using. And you know, and it's it's something which often gets confused, capital and wealth and income and capital, but we need to deconfuse them. I mean, as Beth and I and others for the Land for the Many report, we're pointing out that Piketty confuses capital and wealth. He talks, even the title of his book was Capital in the 21st Century, but almost everything he was talking about was actually wealth, not capital. And capital is that human-made portion of wealth. And yes, absolutely intrinsic to it, if you take the Polanyi view, is the commodification of money and land and labor. But we really need to separate out what is natural wealth and what is the so human generated or accumulated or grabbed or stolen portion of wealth. And so we that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how much natural wealth any one person can possess. Now, that also meshes with some environmental discourse, whether it's contraction and convergence, for example, how we should sort of all converge towards the same levels of carbon usage for those sorts of ideas, whether it's ecological footprinting, we should all converge towards similar footprints. So it's not as if there's no discussion along those lines, but I think what Ingrid has done and where we should go is to make explicit that we're talking about like a totality of natural wealth use here. And then absolutely we should start discussing where that level should lie.
And to ask another question about the politics of this idea, we can have a maximum amount of wealth. I assume taxation is an important aspect of grabbing hold of it and ensuring that ceiling. And you may have hinted at this already, that land tax might be at least one part of the solution. But we are living in an age, I think, where it's increasingly difficult to tax the very rich. They're very adept at moving their money around the globe. So I guess, is it feasible? I guess is one of the questions I have. What are the politics of really obtaining that wealth and enforcing a maximum ceiling?
Well, I mean, we got Biden talking about a global tax treaty, effectively to make wealth or money discoverable wherever it might be, and that is an important element. It really is, and the very fact that he's talking about it suggests that it's not as impossible as it seemed. But actually, in some ways, the easiest things to tax are the things you can't move to the Caymans. You can't take your house and your land and dump it in the Cayman Islands or in Panama City in a filing cabinet. So it's those fixed assets, but also the use of carbon, whatever. There's lots of ways of taxing environmental harm, which are actually probably easier than chasing down money in tax havens. And in our Land for the Many report, we do talk about very substantial tax reform. We talk, I mean, this is very much in the UK context, but we were drawing on examples from around the world. We talk about replacing council tax, which is grossly unfair and regressive and banded in a really crazy way, which is basically designed to give the rich an easy ride and extract money from the poor. Replacing it with a progressive property tax levied only on the owners of property, not tenants, and value charged according to the value of that property, which is almost entirely means land, because 70% of the value of a house, for instance, is the value of the land that it sits on, and that cost has risen by over 500% since 1995, and is rising very fast even now. And we also talk about replacing business rates with land value taxation. We've got a series of fiscal measures which I think would make this system a lot fairer. And none of them are hard to come up with. They're all pretty obvious ideas, but it's quite amazing that we stick with this extremely unfair and regressive system instead. I mean, the backlash we got to that report shows, it illustrates what you're saying, that these things are very fiercely resisted. They're very sensitive, obviously, because the rich are totally invested in maintaining large amounts of exclusive property, ideally for which they don't have to pay. I mean, it's a fairy tale, isn't it? It's a fairy tale with which we're supposed to hope that our lives end. We withdraw ourselves from society. We live in a huge mansion and we build a great big wall around it and no one else can come in. That's the fairy tale ending that you get in so many books and films and cultural stories. And it's a nightmare ending. You become the ogre. You kill the ogre and then you become the ogre. That's what happens with Puss in Boots. He moves into the ogre's palace. And so what's been gained this way? Of course, the ogre in all these stories is a landowner. That's what ogres were. It was a safe way of talking about the oppressive lord of the manor by telling a story about an ogre. But then at the end of the story, almost invariably, you become the ogre. You become the lord of the manor. Well, we need a new story here. That we can't continue to live by that story and expect a fair world.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we've received a few questions about this sort of rethinking of democracy, the idea of turning politics into a commons and introducing various forms of deliberative democracy. One question we've received says, traditionally, commons have been mismanaged rather than managed. Do you have any suggestions on how the commons could be managed, how public luxury could be sort of ensured in this commons?
Well, it's actually a myth that traditionally commons have been mismanaged, and it was a myth put about by a eugenicist and white supremacist called, I've just temporarily forgotten his name. It was an article in 1968 in Science, Garrett Hardin, who wrote an article called The Tragedy of the Commons. And he suggested that in a situation where you've got 100 pastoralists, 100 herders on a piece of land, each of them has got an incentive to put an extra animal into their herds because they gain a whole animal and they lose only 1% of the value of the pasture caused by the degradation caused by that extra animal. And he said this will happen inevitably in all commons because individual interest will end up overriding the collective interest. It's not at all what happens in commons. And in fact, towards the end of his life, I had a correspondence with Garrett Hardin, and it turned out he'd never seen a commons. He'd never had any contact with the commons. He didn't even know what a commons was in theory. What he was talking about was an open access regime. Now, the high seas, and indeed most of the seas, for the fishing industry, for instance, they're an open access regime. People can turn up and there might be some small restrictions like quotas, but basically you're just grabbing resources which aren't deemed to belong to any particular group or anything. You can just grab what you want. But a commons is managed by a community. It is common property. It's the property or under the management aegis of a particular group. Now, I took a particular interest in this because when I first came across Garrett Hardin's paper, and it was in 1992, I beg your pardon, I was working in northern Kenya with a community of pastoralists who managed their land as a commons. And they didn't tolerate people just putting extra animals on their land and turning up to exploit their commons. If someone turned up without permission and started grazing in their gallery forests or grazing in their pastures, outside the community agreement that they'd made, they would drive that person away with sticks. If they did it twice, they would tie them to a tree and beat them with sticks. If they did it 3 times, they would kill them. Now, it might not be the approach that we would take, but it shows pretty unequivocally that this was not an open access regime and it did not work in the way that Garrett Hardin said it worked. This was a very closely controlled and carefully managed regime, which was managed to try to maximize the equal prosperity of all the people who made use of that, and in such a way that the resource was not degraded. Now, there are mismanaged commons. There's some in this country. I mean, Dartmoor, the common land on Dartmoor is grossly mismanaged. The commons arrangement is basically broken down. The same in the Lake District, where we're talking about herders here, but sheep farmers on the whole, cattle farmers sometimes. It's all fallen apart, and there's you look at some interesting reasons as to why it's fallen apart and why people are over exploiting that resource. But in the great majority of commons, where there's effective commoning, that does not happen. In our allotment association, it works incredibly well, and we're managing that land much better than either the council is managing the adjoining land in the next door park, or private owners in the farmland beyond the city are managing their land. Ours is in a much better state. Our soil is in a much better state. We use far lower resources in managing it because we've got those rules that we've agreed between ourselves. Now, those can always be improved, but it's quite amazing how the supposed debate about the commons takes place without any reference to Elinor Ostrom or all the theories of commoning, all the experience of commoning, which is now huge in the academic literature. There's so many books have been written describing commons and how they work. Maybe in one of the subsequent questions we can come on to the political context which you raised in asking that.
Thanks, George. And a question here from Peter. How would you see the ecological challenges in places such as Vienna, which follow the public luxury principle a lot more than others, but nonetheless have an unsustainable social metabolism?
Yeah, no, well, it's a very good question. It's not that public luxury doesn't cancel out private luxury. That's the crucial thing, I think, and that's why the other half of the equation must also be there, which is private sufficiency. If you're trying to pursue private luxury and public luxury, well, those clash head on, because wait a minute, I want that land which you're taking for the park, I want it for my garden, and so there's obviously not going to be enough. But secondly, you're not going to solve very much if everybody is still grabbing as much wealth as they possibly can for themselves. And Vienna is a very good example because it has a good public sphere, but it also has a lot of very rich people trying to enhance their own private acquisition of wealth. And so you've got to have both halves involved. That's why Ingrid's rule is so important, of limitarianism. There has to be a cap on the amount of wealth that any one of us can accumulate, and so it's those two halves. That's the important thing there.
Thanks. I think Eric disagrees with you on one point. It's mainly about your focus on maximum income and maximum consumption, I believe. So it sounds to Eric like there should be more of a focus put on who controls land and production and resources and how they control them and utilize them, rather than on maximum consumption. He believes this would lead to a reduction in consumption by those now in control and greater equity. Do you agree with that, George?
I'm not quite sure how it differs from what I'm saying, because I'm talking about different ways in which land is allocated and controlled. If we're to stick with land as our example, it's all about whether it's a private individual or family which controls that land, or whether it's a community which controls that land, or a local authority which controls that land. That's exactly what it's about. And we can call it ownership, or we can call it control, and sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other, and sometimes it's a hybrid, and sometimes it's hard to know exactly what it is, what to call your regime. But that's precisely what we're talking about. It's about who it is, what the identity of the owners or controllers or managers of that piece of land might be.
Lovely. And Josh Farley has asked another question about population growth. Just to go back to that, Josh says, doesn't population growth promote inequality? When human populations fall, the power of labour relative to land and capital increases. Pundits lament the slowing growth of the Chinese population because it drives wages up and the rich ultimately benefit.
Yes, that can also be true. Absolutely, it can be. But you know, that's a slightly separate issue from the environmental issue and the way in which human numbers are being blamed for problems largely created by human consumption. And just really to sort of drive that home, you know, while human numbers are rising by 1.05% a year, livestock numbers are rising by 2.4% a year. You know, that's the real population crisis in environmental terms. Now, of course, in labour terms, I mean, you know, there's lots of discussion that we can have there. And, you know, and I'm sure we'll agree between me and Josh that, you know, we need organised labour, we need collective bargaining. And I do accept, of course, that that's harder if you've got a labour surplus. That's absolutely true. But there's lots of reasons for a labour surplus which don't necessarily come down to population. That might be a contributory factor, but it's by no means the only one.
There's another question here from Josh. He says, humans outweigh terrestrial vertebrates 10 to 1. Even if we were all vegans, we would be responsible for a disproportionate share of global metabolism. Isn't lack of concern for human population growth extremely anthropocentric?
No, it's really not true that we outweigh terrestrial vertebrates 10 to 1. It's our livestock which is the main contributor to that. So 96% of the world's vertebrates, terrestrial vertebrates, or the world's mammals, is it? 96% of the world's mammals are livestock or humans, but it's livestock which, as far as I can remember, contribute the majority of that. I will need to check that. But yeah, I mean, you know, there are ways in which we can minimize our footprint, and going vegan is actually a really important way of doing that. It's a crucial aspect of reducing our impact on the planet. But you know, even if we say, okay, you know, population has a major impact, you know, and it definitely has an impact in some parts of the world. It is an issue. It is a factor. What do you intend to do about it? You know, what's your plan? Yeah, we all agree. Absolutely, there should be female empowerment, female literacy, you know, which are definitely connected with smaller numbers of children. But actually, even if you maximised the lower birth rates worldwide, you would address only a small part of population growth because of the demographic bulge going through the demographic momentum. Even if somehow you could wave a magic wand and all the patriarchy and all the inequality and all the other reasons why women don't have full control over their own bodies and full opportunities and full literacy and all the other things which I think we'd probably all agree are absolutely essential values. If you wave that magic wand, you still wouldn't stop the majority of population growth because of that momentum. So what are you going to do? You're going to go around massacring people? Is that the plan? Because if you don't have a plan, shut up. I mean, seriously, what's the point of talking about it, of going on and on and on about it? I'm sorry, this really drives me mad. Constantly creating about population growth if you actually don't know what you're going to do about it. And you know what? Often I think that's exactly why people talk about it. Because it relieves us of the need for agency. It relieves us of moral choice. We don't have to do anything about it because we can't do anything about it, so we can just whinge about it. Whereas consumption, you can do something about. The way we live today, you can do something about. Eating animals, you can do something about. Taking flights, you can do something about. Driving everywhere in your car, you can do something about that. You know, the amount of electronics goods, you can do something about that. But why do you not want to talk about that, but talk about population instead? Well, I think half the reason is you can't do anything about it. So it's safe to talk about. Sorry to get a bit heated about this, but I've had this so many times. And I'm absolutely convinced now that it's that lack of agency which makes it so attractive to people.
I hesitate to disagree with you on something you're so passionate about, George, but to go back to those far right parties that I mentioned before, the Marine Le Pens of this world, I sometimes think that they are, in their party rhetoric, trying to fuse together immigration and population growth and ecological degradation to try to make the case that immigration will lead to this population bomb. And we certainly can't have them, the other, coming over here to live Western lifestyles. So I think for those particular movements and far right figures, there is an answer, but it's just not an answer that we would.
Yeah, no, I mean, maybe you can credit the far right with having a coherent program, but unless people want to subscribe to the far right's coherent program, I mean, really, what's your program? What is your program?
It certainly wasn't coherent, but I was just sort of trying to point out that there probably is an end goal for them. There is a sort of a policy that they're trying to justify at the end of that discourse, at least in my view. Maybe we can move on to a question about rights for nature. So the question received says, what do you think of the rights of nature movement? And in particular, examples like, I'm going to mispronounce this and I apologize, Wanganua River settlement, which puts indigenous worldview principles at the forefront of decision making for all people using the river. Is this a source of hope?
I think this is a really positive and interesting way forward, and the Maori people in particular bringing their perspective on their relationship with the natural world, which is so different to that of the Europeans, I think have really put a fascinating and crucial idea on the map, which is that we no longer treat the living world as something which is there for us to dominate, as a resource for us to exploit, but as something which has value and life in its own right, intrinsic qualities, intrinsic value, which you can't break down into just what it can do for us, but it's about what it is as well. And I think that legal recognition, that personhood for the river, which is now being picked up in other parts of the world, and people are seeking legal personhood for other natural features, parts of the world. I think this is a really exciting and important development. Now, in a way, it shouldn't be necessary. You shouldn't have to put this into human law for us to recognize the intrinsic value of something, but you could see it as a sort of counter movement to the way in which, to John Locke's principle that we can just acquire natural wealth and call it ours. In order to protect the living world against that belief system, that ideology, we have to give the living world also human-made legal rights to protect it from our human-made legal rights of private property and natural wealth. And in a way, it's a shame that that's the way we have to do it. But given where we are, I think that is actually a step forward.
Yeah, there is some positive comments as well made by various other people in the chat box. Duncan Crowley also believes this could be a game changer. Well, he poses that as a question, but there seems to be some hope there that we could see river guardians all over the planet. We have time for a few more questions. Oh, Beth has just sent me one now. Thanks very much, Beth. So there's been a few comments on Tigre. The Tigre example demonstrates that public policy is an essential variable along with wealth and consumption in a study of carrying capacity. It is only through this window that we can understand how resources relate to economy and wealth. Do you have any thoughts on that, George?
Well, I mean, just to reinforce that, it really is so much about policy, and it's about whether that policy is oriented towards general prosperity or towards individual prosperity, which necessarily, when we're talking about natural wealth, must be against general prosperity. And unfortunately, we're in a country where it's the political class just doesn't even seem to be capable of recognizing the idea that you might do something for the sake of other people. It's all about just grabbing what you can as quickly as you can, and that puts us into a very dangerous place.
Absolutely. And final question, George. Again, it relates to questions of global inequality. There's been a lot of controversy about the Green New Deal, with some people believing it to be a form of neo-colonialism, precisely because it leads to resource extraction of various kinds. You mentioned in your talk that nickel was a mineral that we're going to run short of, and at the time you were talking at the sort of individual level, but you certainly can scale that up to talk about countries and the global north. So I wondered whether you thought a Green New Deal could be part of a just transition, and if it is, should there be some kind of compensatory measures that go alongside it?
Thank you, Dan. Well, this is a really important question because you can see very easily how a supposedly green economy could be just as extractive and coercive as the economy it's supposed to replace. And the classic example is electric cars. Now, there's lots of ways in which you could redesign the transport system. And there's some really good ways in which you could redesign the transport system to make it greener. And that's, for instance, doing the sort of thing that Anne Hidalgo is doing in Paris, creating the 15-minute city, trying to reduce the need to travel by making sure that everything you need is within a 15-minute walk of where you live, including your job, your shops, your school, whatever it might be. And so, that's the first thing in the hierarchy, reduce the need. Second, change the mode. So, walk and cycle, which turns out to be very good for those who are capable of walking and cycling. It's good for our health. It's good for community as well, because you meet people and you talk to them on the way. It's good to have lots of people in the street because you look out for each other. There's less chance of people doing bad things if there's lots of people in the street. There's lots and lots of good things about walking and cycling. And then you would also encourage people out of their cars for longer journeys and onto public transport, be it trams or buses in the city or light rail, or long distance railways, coach transport. And there's some very interesting ways in which the coach network could be completely reconfigured to actually be an efficient network. Wouldn't that be nice? And there's lots of ways to do it, but the worst way you could possibly green transport is to take the existing habits and the existing modes, with people going everywhere in their private cars and just changing the kind of car. And what that requires is huge amounts of lithium, nickel, copper, loads of other minerals, including many which involve extremely exploitative relations. We're fully aware of what happens in Congo, for example, with the tantalite and cobalt mining there, with basically what's happening is slavery. These are blood minerals. But there's similar things done by big multinational corporations, like in West Papua, with the theft of copper there, theft of people's land, and the massive expatriation of huge amounts of copper. And copper is in massive demand because of the electrical transition. So we have to minimize our use of those resources, but we can't do that by pursuing a private luxury approach. We can only do that by pursuing a public luxury approach. And what Anne Hidalgo is doing, the 15-minute city, is public luxury. Good public transport is public luxury, and it uses far smaller resources than the private luxury required by all of us having electric cars. But even with electric trains and electric buses and the rest of it, you're still obviously using resources to the greatest extent possible. We should be recycling those, and ideally we should be crushing up the cars and recycling the minerals that they contain and using them for public transport. And we'll probably find there's more than enough already in our countries to basically support the entire infrastructure. But that, so you reduce and you reuse and you recycle before you even think about extracting new resources and turning new places into sacrifice and extraction zones.
Wonderful. Let's try, if we can, finish on a note of hope here. Jen Hinton has asked one final question. She's a journalist who tracks the public narrative to some extent. She wants to know, do you see any signs of hope for the narrative shifting, the narrative amongst, I guess, the population quite broadly? Do you see many signs that the narrative is shifting towards a greener, maybe a post-growth direction?
Well, thank you very much for raising that, Jen, because I think it's a crucial issue. As movements, we've been really, really crap at narrative. Narrative is crucial in politics. It's absolutely essential in politics. Unless you can tell people where we are, how we got here, and where we're going, which is basically the three components of narrative, then you can't carry them along at all. This is where Labour is going wrong at the moment under Keir Starmer. There's just absolutely no sense of direction because there's no narrative. He's not telling us where we are. I mean, that's the simplest thing, where we are, the mess that we're in. He's not explaining that clearly. He's not explaining how we got here, whether it's through neoliberalism and austerity or the new sort of killer clown movement propelled by oligarchs. He's not explaining any of that. And he's got absolutely no vision about where we're going. So no component of the story is there. And we just have to become better storytellers. In fact, this is what my last book was all about, was about creating narratives in politics and what narratives work. And it turns out that there's a particular narrative structure that works extremely well in public life, which is the restoration narrative. It's the Lord of the Rings story, the Harry Potter story, the Bible story, which basically goes, the world has been, or the land has been thrown into disorder by powerful and nefarious forces working against the interests of society. And the hero or heroes confronts those powerful nefarious forces against the odds, overthrows them, and restores harmony to the land. That's the basic narrative. That one of the basic plots is the one that works in politics and religion. And all successful movements have used it. Whether it's Keynes or the neoliberals, whether it's the communists, whether it's the Nazis, whichever part of the spectrum you're on, that has been the successful narrative structure. It says nothing about the content, it's just a structure you use. And we need to start creating effective narratives, which I think need to use that structure, because that is proven time and time again to be the one that works, to tell us where we're going, to explain that movement forward. If you want a short summary of it, I did a 15-minute TED talk about that narrative and how we might make it work in politics.
Well, what a wonderful way to finish. Thanks so much, George. It's been a real pleasure having you here. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Dan. Thank you, Beth, and thank you for everyone for listening. Sorry I got a bit heated about the population thing. I've just, it's driven me mad over the years. Absolutely mad, as you can tell, but madder, I should say. But anyway,
no problem
it's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Yeah, we like people being passionate over here.
I was just going to say, it feels very unnatural, doesn't it, not to have a moment of rapturous applause at the end of this, but there are lots of love and appreciation coming through in the comments, almost more of that than there were questions, so take that instead of applause.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a real pleasure, so thanks. Sorry I can't see you or meet you, but there we are.
Thanks, George. It's certainly been a great way to close the conference. And I'm afraid it is now time to close the conference. This is our final session. So on behalf of all the team in Manchester, thank you. It's been our privilege to host the first ever joint conference between the ISEE, ESEE, and the International Degrowth Research Network. If anybody has missed any of the plenaries, we'll do our best to throw them up online at some point in the very near future, whenever John and I can work out how to do it, probably. And before we sign off, what's really important is that we thank everybody who needs to be thanked. Thank you, first of all, to all of my colleagues and friends on the local organising committee. You've all worked so hard over the last 2 years, preparing 2 conferences, essentially, last year and this year. Unfortunately, last year, of course, didn't happen. It got transformed into a colloquium. Thank you also to the technical team, HG3 in particular, who have really given us the digital platform upon which we can have these conversations. Thank you so much to them. Thank you to all the student volunteers who have done such a great job. Thank you to everyone who volunteered to moderate a session. The conference really wouldn't have been possible without you and all your talent and hard work. So thank you so much. And thanks as well to everyone who attended these sessions and engaged in these debates. I hope you really enjoyed it, and I hope we can continue to share ideas of and for change in the very near future. So from all of us here in Manchester to wherever you are, take care.